Our scripture for this morning is taken from Mark chapter 8, verses 11 to 21, and I'm reading from the Common English Bible. The Pharisees showed up and began to argue with Jesus. To test him, they asked for a sign from heaven. With an impatient sigh, Jesus said, "Why does this generation look for a sign? I assure you that no sign will be given to it." Leaving them, he got back in the boat and crossed to the other side of the lake. Jesus' disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, so they had only one loaf with them in the boat. He gave them strict orders. "Watch out and be on your guard for the yeast of the Pharisees as well as the yeast of Herod." The disciples discussed this among themselves. "He said this because we have no bread." Jesus knew what they were discussing and said, "Why are you talking about the fact that we don't have any bread? Don't you grasp what has happened? Don't you understand? Are your hearts so resistant to what God is doing? Don't you have eyes? Why can't you see? Don't you have ears? Why can't you hear? Don't you remember? When I broke 5 loaves of bread for those 5,000 people, how many baskets full of leftovers did you gather?" They answered, 12. "And when I broke 7 loaves of bread for those 4,000 people, how many baskets full of leftovers did you gather?" They answered, 7. Jesus said to them, "And you still don't understand?"
Thanks, Verna, for that reading. As I was studying about this passage this week, one of the books that I read said this is maybe the most confusing passage in the whole book of Mark. So if you walk away from this having learned anything, then I've overcome that confusion. This is a strange story in the sense that it's a continuation of the feeding stories. And yet, we see that the disciples don't seem to have learned anything. And there are a couple of ways that they could have and should have learned something. So they've been traveling with Jesus. They've seen and benefited from these miracles. And they know that when Jesus is around, everybody has enough. But when they get on the boat, they haven't brought any bread. So, have they learned in that way that they don't need to worry about it? Jesus will just do miracles. Or have they failed to learn, okay, when we're with Jesus, we're sometimes going to stay over longer. We should have extra food. Then they haven't learned in that way. Jesus is teaching about the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. But the disciples seem to be thinking that it's about the bread, so then they haven't learned to kind of follow Jesus' train of thought. The disciples are supposed to be the students, they're supposed to be learning, and still we're a little over halfway through Mark, presumably halfway through Jesus' ministry, and they're still pretty clueless sometimes. This whole story is about bread and yeast. And these are both common symbols in the Bible. And so I wanted to kind of explore these ideas, the meanings. What is yeast? What does it do? And we should know this, shouldn't we? I was listening to a CBC documentary a while ago talking about bread and how in many ways bread colonized the world. That bread was one of the civilizing forces of humanity. For a long time, bread was the central currency in many societies. Bread is a staple of Western diet. When I was in Korea or Thailand, I could go a whole day without eating bread, a whole week. But in here, it's pretty tough to go a day without eating bread. And the Canadian prairies were largely settled because the land was ideal for growing wheat. And when we started growing wheat in Canada, we were shipping wheat around the world, and Canada became an important, powerful country because we could grow wheat, because the world eats bread. Bread is central to how we, at least in the West, operate. I was in Nanton a little while ago when my parents were visiting, and they have the Western Canadian Grain Elevator Museum. Grain elevators are falling down, burning down all across the West. But every now and then a community says, no, we're going to preserve ours. We're going to keep it. And Nanton has done that, and you can get a guided tour, and they will explain the different rooms and the different machinery that made it work. And for a long time you could get the same information at Heritage Park, and one of the men here would have been happy to give you that tour. There is a lot to learn about Western Canada by looking at grain elevators. And now we ignore them, we don't see them, we don't think about them, but they tell a part of our story. And it's interesting how in the pandemic, a lot of people said, well, I've got all this time, maybe I should learn some new skills. Well, what was the new skill? Many of us learned baking bread. This activity that's been at the core of our diet for millennia, and that's the new skill we learned. Because we have all this time, baking takes time, maybe we can just bake at home. An interesting concept. All this time later, we decided new skill is going to be baking bread. But what is bread without yeast? The people of Israel got really good at making bread without yeast. Most of the mentions of yeast in the Bible, or leaven, depending on your translation, comes in the Old Testament in the negative form as a description of the kind of bread the people should make. The people of Israel needed to make unleavened bread. First of all, in Egypt, they were going to be rescued in the night, and they were going to have to be ready to go really quickly. So, get your food ready. We're going to have to go. You don't have time to make regular bread. You don't have time for yeast, so we're just going to make unleavened bread, unyeasted bread. And then you have to be ready. And then that event was so formative, so important to the people of Israel that they repeated that. They had religious celebrations that involved making and eating unleavened bread so that they could remember the time where they had to rush out. If you want to be connected to the history of the people of Israel, you have to eat bread without yeast, because once upon a time they didn't have that time. Once they didn't have the luxury and the comfort of waiting for bread to rise. And you can get used to eating unleavened bread. You can find alternatives, other things that add sponginess or softness to the bread that you eat, but it's not quite the same. So I was looking at the website. I usually get bread from one of the bakeries in town. So I looked at one of their websites to see the health information. Because if you sell food in this country, you have to provide the ingredients. So I looked at the website, and it listed off all the ingredients, and everything you would expect was there. Flour, sugar, salt, oil, water, yeast. And yeast was the last on the list, not because alphabetically, not because of price or anything else. Yeast is the least common ingredient in bread. There's more flour, Of course, you can taste the flour. It's mostly flour. There's more sugar than yeast, at least in the bread that I buy. And the bread is not sweet. It says there's more salt than yeast, and the bread isn't salty. But if you don't include the yeast, if you get the yeast ratio off, you know it right away. Yeast. We can have scientists explain to us what yeast is, or how it functions organically. I won't get into that explanation here. But yeast is an insignificant ingredient by quantity, but it is not an insignificant ingredient by impact. When we look at New Testament mentions of yeast, Jesus uses this as a comparison, a couple of times in good ways and in bad ways. So Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman mixed into a great vast batch of dough until the yeast had worked its way into the whole batch. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast. The kingdom of heaven, an idea that Jesus talks about, the concept, a place where people live by the values of God. A place where there's no difference between rich and poor in the eyes of the leadership and in the eyes of the people themselves. The kingdom of God where everybody looks out for each other, where we are guided by love instead of selfishness. That idea, the kingdom of God, is like yeast. It can be a very small thing, but it makes an incredible difference. And at our best, and we haven't always been at our best, the church has demonstrated that. At times in history, the church has shown love towards immigrants, towards slaves, towards poor people, towards sick people. And at our best, the church has demonstrated that a little bit of love mixed in with all of the things that we do as a community, a little bit of love can make a world of difference. But Jesus also uses yeast as a negative, as a challenge, as a warning, and this is one of the times that he does that. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees, beware the yeast of Herod. So the same comparison is made in all four Gospels. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew decides to clarify or add Jesus saying, beware the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So let's use that as the yeast that we're warning against. Jesus has an odd relationship with the Pharisees. And if you would listen to some Christians talk, you would think that the Pharisees were just this evil band of people going around causing harm everywhere they went. But the Pharisees were religious leaders and scholars who were very interested in the law. And they looked at Israel as a nation, a country that had been regularly subjugated by other powers. So at Jesus' time, the Romans were in charge. Before that, the Greeks were in charge. Before that, there was Babylon and then Assyria. All of these other nations had come in and they were influencing, they were controlling, they were limiting what Israel could be. And the Pharisees, they looked over the scriptures, they looked over the stories of the people, and they said, what we need to do is get our act together. We need to follow God's laws. And when we do that, the rest will work itself out. And at their best, they would get things right, and they would make sure that immigrants were fed. They would make sure that widows were provided for. They would make sure that there was enough money for the priests to do the ritual sacrifices and all of the things that happened within the religious system. At their best, the Pharisees did good and important work in their community. At their best. So Jesus says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees. So, if we imagine a Pharisee as a loaf of bread, then mostly what we see is the flour and the way that it's baked and mixed in. We see the religiosity. We see the proper clothing of religious leaders. We see the emphasis on law. We see all of the good things within the religious institution that existed. We see that. But behind the clothing, behind the fancy words, there was a yeast. There was something working inside, bubbling through all of it, that was changing its nature into something different, something unhealthy. The conflict that Jesus had with the religious leaders, with the Pharisees, it wasn't because they were inherently evil and they wanted to do evil things. It's because they were working so hard to be good, but they were more interested in people seeing them as good than they were interested in the fruit of their good actions. Matthew doesn't mention the yeast of Herod. Matthew doesn't say that Herod is a hypocrite, because Herod is not a hypocrite. We can look through the stories of Herod and we can say all sorts of bad things about him. Easily. We can and we should read these stories and see these are the things Herod is doing that are wrong, but Herod is not a hypocrite. Right? We know what a hypocrite is. A hypocrite is a person who has one set of stated values and they have a set of actions that are inconsistent with those values. And when we look at the business world, we can say, hey, why aren't these food corporations, why aren't they selling food at a reasonable price? We can complain about their greed. We can complain about their crooked business practices. We can complain about why anybody needs to make as much money as their CEOs make. But we can't call them hypocrites. They're corporations. They exist to make money. That's not hypocritical for them to be greedy. Right? We can't call Herod a hypocrite because Herod is the king. Sure, he's a puppet king. His power is protected and orchestrated by the Romans. But Herod is a king. Herod wants to hold on to power, and he will do evil, greedy, jealous things to hold on to his power. It is evil, it is greedy, it is jealous, but it is not hypocritical. The yeast of Herod is not hypocrisy. The yeast of Herod is an addiction to power. So we have Pharisees whose yeast is hypocrisy. And we have Herod whose yeast is addiction to power and the ways that power can corrupt. But it's important to note here that Jesus isn't just pointing out that the Pharisees have yeast. Jesus isn't just pointing out that Herod has yeast. Jesus is saying to his disciples, be on the lookout, watch out, be on guard, because there is yeast in those two parts of our community, and both of them will be a temptation to you, disciples of Jesus. Be on the lookout. It's one thing to say, for us to say, wow, those CEOs, bunch of greedy fat cats. Greed is a temptation to us as well. It's one thing for us to look around and see greed and corruption, to see heartlessness, to see all the things that make this world fall apart. We can point those out. We can look at other people and say, there's yeast working in that person, and it's making them greedy, it's making them hateful, it's making them violent. That yeast can turn in us as well. So why is it that Jesus thinks that his disciples, 12 men, 12 fishermen, tax collectors, religious zealots, a bunch of nobodies, really, they were nobodies until Jesus came along. Why are they susceptible to the temptations of Herod and the Pharisees? Because none of them are on track to become king. None of them are studying to become Pharisees. So why does Jesus think that they need to be on guard for those temptations? And we need to pay attention to this, because if those disciples have to worry about that, then we, his present-day disciples, also need to look out for these temptations. This isn't the first time that Jesus has mentioned these groups together. In earlier stories, we see that the Pharisees and the Herodians have come to an agreement, that they are working together, that they need to stop Jesus. And in some ways, these groups have nothing in common. Because the Herodians, the supporters of Herod, they want power. They will stop at nothing to get and hold and nurture and increase their power. And the Pharisees over here want righteousness. They want law-abiding Jews in their nation. And they will confront rule breakers. They will say what they need to say. They will confront who they need to confront, so that everybody knows following the law is the only thing that's going to save us as a nation. There's no overlap between what these groups are doing. Except every now and then, they get close to each other. Because political forces then aren't very different then than they are now. And we would say, well, hold on a second. We get to elect our leaders, and they're accountable to us. And if they're corrupt, they get punished. That might be a little bit idealistic, but they get power, and they also still try to hold on to power. So how is this the same? So from time to time, people with political power, and that's not restricted to just people who've been elected. The political system is bigger than just the people who get voted in. But there are people with political power, and they know that their hold on power is temporary. Because in a democratic system, there's an election cycle, and things are really outside of their control, and we as the people can just change our minds and vote for somebody else. But outside of a democratic system, you have power right up until somebody else marches in and takes your power away. So every now and then they have to be careful about things that are testing and challenging their power. And that's what Jesus was. Jesus came in and he spoke with authority. His authority. God's authority. Jesus didn't wait for the Pharisees and for the religious system to say, yep, this is our guy. He's one of us. He's studied at the right schools. He's standing behind the right pulpit. He's saying the right words. You guys can listen to him. He's one of us. Jesus didn't wait for that. Most religious systems now require that. Jesus didn't wait for that. But Jesus also didn't try to say safe things to keep the powers around him happy. If Jesus said things that could upset a crowd, he would say them. If Jesus said things to make a crowd excited, he would say things. And so the powers in place, they recognized Jesus is popular. And if Jesus is going to say things, he can turn a crowd against us. So we either need to get Jesus on board with us, or we need to stop him. And what they did, they couldn't get Jesus on board because Jesus didn't respect their authority. They went to the Pharisees. And they said, maybe we can work something out here. Well, what did they gain from that? Well, if the Pharisees can proclaim that Jesus is a false teacher, then in theory that will change the minds of the crowds, that will lessen Jesus' power, and it'll increase Herod's power. Well, what do the Pharisees get in that deal? Well, the powers that be, they can say to the Pharisees, hey, listen, if you just work with our agenda for a little bit, hey, we can get some of your stuff in place. We can take some of your laws that you think are important. We can make some of that happen. Just take it easy on us. Like, don't challenge us, right? Don't point out our adultery. Don't point out our corruption. Just talk about your religious laws. We'll give you more power to do that, and it'll be a win-win. When they work together, then in their minds, Jesus will be suppressed, and they'll lift each other up and both win. Except they have to lie to do it, because the Herodians, Herod doesn't care about the Pharisees' religious agenda. And the Pharisees have to compromise their values because Herod does not live by the Pharisees' laws. So when you see religious institutions celebrating political parties and political values, you know they've corrupted themselves. And the yeast of the Pharisees is working inside of them, because they're trying to be lifted up. They're trying to get their agenda done with a shortcut. They're trying to get their agenda done through power that shouldn't be theirs. That's the yeast of the Pharisees, a willingness to compromise their values to get attention. All of us are susceptible to that too. We have values, but our values will only result in slow change. The people with power, they have values, but they have power, and they need to get more power, and they'll throw their values out the window as long as it gets them more power. That's their yeast. A lot of us like to think we're pretty good at deciphering the yeast, the forces that bubble up inside of other people. But what we're supposed to be doing is evaluating the yeast in us. And when you look at other people, you can see the good yeast a lot of times. When someone's just bursting with love for their family, for the people around them, you can see love on their faces. When generosity is the thing bubbling up inside of them, you can see that. Kindness, patience, all of those things bubble up inside of us if we let them. But there are yeasts, sins, temptations to be aware of. And in this story, we see those temptations. Corruption, compromise, greed, addiction to power. All of those things were a temptation to them, like they are a temptation to us. In this story, we see Jesus calling his disciples to rely on him. Don't become like them, because this road is going to take us to powerful and popular places. But if you compromise your values, all of it will be for nothing. This road will take us on a journey where we're going to reflect on who God is and what we're supposed to be doing in the world. But if we compromise it to get more popular, none of it will matter. And the same challenge goes to us. That we're trying to be more loving, we're trying to be more generous, more peaceful, all of those things. But if we compromise those for popularity, if we compromise those for power, none of it matters. So, let's lean on Jesus. Let's follow him. Let's be true to ourselves and true to the kingdom. And the reward will come slowly but surely.